Well, we've had one half of our Canadian connection here on the show this afternoon. Here's the other half. Producer Clark is in the house with me. Good afternoon, sir.
How's it going, Brian? I can't escape Rod. He's everywhere. He's everywhere.
Which matchup are you looking forward to this weekend?
Oh, well, there's one in particular that has my eye, especially in the NHL, and that has to be Toronto versus Boston on Saturday night, the marquee game. These are the top two teams in the league right now, Brian, and they're in the same division. And if you know, for your listeners out there, that means that they have to potentially play each other in the playoffs, because how the NHL works, of course, is it's not one versus 8, 2 versus 7 in the playoffs. You stay within your division for the first two rounds. So that it just goes to show that how good the Maple Leafs are and how screwed they are with the current playoff format, because even though they're the second best team in the league, they're not even first in their division. That's how good the Boston Bruins have been this season.
The Bruins have been absolutely fantastic this year. Toronto has had a great turnaround. But what does Toronto have to do to get out of the doldrums and actually make some noise in the playoffs? Well, first things first, they got to get by Boston, because they're going to see each other.
Yeah, well, even first things first, before that first thing is that they probably have to end up getting by Tampa Bay, who's obviously been so successful over the last 3 years, 3 straight Stanley Cup finals, 2 of those being championships. And right now they're like locked into a playoff matchup. Like it's all signs are pointing that way at the moment.
Yeah.
You see Toronto with a 26-9-7 record this season, 59 points. Obviously, we talked about Boston. They've only lost 4 games in regulation all season. And Tampa Bay is right behind both of them with 8 points less than Toronto. But that it just, like I said, it's lining up for Toronto to play Tampa again in the first round, which obviously brings back traumatic memories for a lot of Leafs fans from last season, and for good reason. And for seasons gone by as well, Toronto's obviously had that really odd playoff non-success streak. So, like you said, I think what Toronto has to do, they definitely have a different identity this year, Brian, which is one thing that I've really, as a fan myself, and I will be a little bit biased here as a fan, but I've appreciated their new approach this season. They have a different identity this season as a team overall. They've revamped their forward group so that the bottom 6 of their 12 forwards have a little bit more tenacity to them. They're a little bit more forechecky, more physical, maybe not as gritty as some people might like, but just the way that those guys have all played on a night in, night out basis. It's definitely a different look than last year, whereas last year, those guys, they tried to have a bit more of a skillful bottom 6. But this year they've gone to a little bit more lunch pail, blue collar approach. And that's been echoed in some of the guys that they've added. So that's definitely one thing that's changed. They've been getting some goaltending this year, which has been a problem for the last couple of years.
Right.
Obviously, a couple of guys that they brought in. Matt Murray has won 2 Stanley Cups, but he's had nothing but problems for the last few years since. And Ilya Samsonov, who is coming over from the Washington Capitals, they let him walk as a 25-year-old starting goaltender. They just let him go because he's had some struggles as well, and he's been performing great as well. So those are 2 of the biggest things. Their defensive play has been upgraded as a team. A lot of people like to look at defense like, oh, this team's not good enough at defense. They need to go at a defenseman. But overall, the team defense has really improved over the last couple of years. This year's a really shining example of that. So I'm not going to say it is a different year, because every Leaf fan likes to say every year that it's a different. It feels different this year, but it's definitely at least a different approach. They've definitely changed their approach this year, and it's been evident in the style that they've played throughout the season so far.
Producer Clark joining me here on the program this afternoon. Let's look at the Western Conference. Who stands out to you in the West right now?
The West is wild because, everybody going into the season said, well, Colorado's obvious. Colorado's the defending champions. They brought back a good chunk of their team. They did lose quite a bit in terms of some of the important pieces that they lost. Nazem Kadri, of course, who was their second-line center, very important player. They lost a couple of wingers that were impactful, especially in the playoffs. Vegas, though, is the one that's really stood out. And the reason for that, Brian, is not just because they're sitting atop the Pacific Division right now, but it's because they went into the season with a huge question mark. And we just talked about goaltending with the Maple Leafs. They lost their starting goalie due to injury before the season even started.
Right.
Robin Lehner has been their starter for the last couple seasons, and he's had some really big health issues, and they just decided that this year he wasn't going to play due to those health issues. So they essentially had 3 guys coming into the season. One was a rookie, and 2 were career backup goaltenders. And the rookie was the one that ended up winning the job, and he has been fantastic. His name's Logan Thompson. And if you don't know him, he comes from the WHL. He played with the Brandon Wheat Kings. Coming out back in the day when I used to work with the Regina Pats, he was with the Wheat Kings. We're kind of rivals there. So that's been an interesting storyline to follow because nobody expected Logan Thompson to be putting up the numbers that he's put up. And yet here we are halfway through the season, and they're essentially atop the Western Conference, tied with a couple of teams. So Vegas stands out for me in a big way, simply because I think they've probably defeated a lot of people's expectations where they missed the playoffs last year. And I think a lot of people were thinking, you know what, maybe they're going to struggle again this year. Sorry, they didn't miss the playoffs, but they didn't do well in the playoffs last year. And everyone thought, well, maybe this year they might miss the playoffs because they have a bunch of injury question marks and the goaltending issue. And again, they're sitting atop the Western Conference halfway through the year.
Man, the Vegas Golden Knights find a way to retool, and they're the team that I'm watching. Any other teams in the Western Conference stand out?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Dallas is another one, and they're atop the Central Division right now. Again, everybody thought Colorado was going to do it. And Dallas is an interesting team because a lot of their important players are really over the hill, Brian. And in terms of hockey, the older players, although they're impactful, hockey is such a fast sport these days. You worry sometimes that if you get into your later 30s now in the NHL, it's such a young man's league. There's a lot of people who are under the age of 30 now in the NHL. The average age has decreased over the last, I'm going to say, decade or so.
Yes.
So with Dallas, their biggest players, Jamie Benn is their captain. He's in his mid to late 30s. Joe Pavelski's in his late 30s. He's been around the block a few times. Tyler Seguin now is reaching 30. And that's a big chunk of who they've been. And they struggled scoring goals the last couple of seasons on and off after they made it to the Stanley Cup final, of course, not that long ago when the COVID thing was going on. They made the Stanley Cup finals. That was Tampa Bay's first championship. And what have they done, Brian, this year? They've scored a ton of goals. They're leading the Central Division. They're leading the Western Conference, I think, actually, or second or third in the Western Conference in goals for. They're shutting teams down with great goaltending and great defense overall. And Jason Robertson has come out of nowhere, and not out of nowhere. He had a decent season last year, but he has really overperformed in terms of what people probably expected. And Jason Robertson's probably an MVP candidate as of today. This has been a kind of a revolutionary season for the Stars because I don't think many people expected them to be where they are. And now they're showing a different life. They're showing that they have some pieces there that are maybe better than people thought. So Dallas is for sure, and Winnipeg as well. If we're going to throw out one more name, Winnipeg last year was a team I picked to make the playoffs, and they didn't. And I think because of that, a lot of people wrote them off this year and thought, well, they won't make the playoffs this year if they didn't last year, because their team's essentially the same. And here they are. They have, with their new head coach, Rick Bowness, they have definitely overperformed in terms of, I think, a lot of people's expectations. I think a lot of people in Winnipeg are a little bit excited, a little bit surprised. And it's been great to watch, to see a team in Winnipeg that was strong for a good 5-year stretch. They were a very strong team, kind of that team that was always on the edge to make a bit of a playoff run. They tried a couple of times. They got pretty deep. They lost a bunch of guys. It's kind of been in flux since. And this year they've found something, and they're right back into that mix of where a lot of people thought they were going to be last year. Now they're doing it this year.
3 teams in the Metropolitan Division and the Eastern Conference: Carolina, New Jersey, and the Rangers, separated by 4 points. 57 for Carolina, 53 for the Rangers. Who do you think winds up taking that division?
Well, any of them could. I mean, New Jersey, I think, got off to a really, really hot start, and everybody, I'm going to say most hockey fans were surprised by that. Have they been building towards something like this? Yeah, they've had some decent off seasons. They've been drafting pretty high the last few years. So they got guys like Nico Hischier, who was a number 1 overall pick, Jack Hughes, who was a number 1 overall pick. And they've picked up some guys along the way, namely a Dougie Hamilton, who's a top defenseman in the league. They've picked up some guys. They've added some pieces. and they've built an interesting roster, a very young, talented, skillful roster. But I think they're probably ahead of schedule in terms of what people maybe thought they would be. Now they've struggled in the last little while. In the last 10, they're only 5-4-1. So they went from, kind of winning 7 out of 10 games every stretch of games to now maybe 4 or 5, and they've lost quite a bit more. So I don't know if it's New Jersey's time yet, and especially when you compare them to where Carolina is as an organization and where even New York is as an organization. They're much farther ahead on that progression plan, if you will. And I think, especially when we talk about New York, I think they're probably ripe for an interesting, splashy trade as well at some point in the next few weeks before the trade deadline at the beginning of March. So I would say that if we're talking about right now, it's easy to look at Carolina and say, well, you know what, they're at the top of the standings. I think New York is going to be the team, in my opinion, that might end up coming out of that division at the top, simply because I think, honestly, they've maybe underperformed, even though they have a 23-12-7 record right now, 53 points, which is fantastic, near the top of the NHL. But I feel like they've almost underperformed a little bit this year, in the sense that some of their players maybe aren't having seasons that maybe some people expected them to yet. And I think that they're still kind of working towards what they fully are as a team in general.
Producer Clark joining me here on the afternoon show, talking all things NHL hockey. Always a pleasure to have you on, my man. I appreciate you. I love you very much. Let's do it again soon. Thanks,
Brian. Appreciate it.
And that is going to wrap it up, folks, for this edition of the Brian Snow Show. Thank you all very much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you for tuning into The Brian Snow Show, where sports is the base, life and fun are the results.